In October of 1994, a quiet town in South Carolina suddenly found itself at the center of a national nightmare. A young mother stood before cameras, trembling and tearful, pleading with the public for help. Her voice carried the desperate hope of someone who claimed her children had just been taken. According to her story, a man had approached her car at a red light, forced her out at gunpoint, and driven away with her two small boys still strapped in the back seat. The children were Michael, only 3 years old, and Alex, just 14 months. Within hours, their disappearance sparked an enormous search effort. Police departments, volunteers, and federal agents poured into the small community, hoping to bring the boys home alive. Across the country, viewers watched the heartbreaking appeals on television, sharing in the fear and sympathy that surrounded a mother who seemed to have lost everything in a single terrifying moment. At the center of the tragedy was a young couple whose lives, at least on the surface, appeared ordinary. The boys' parents had married young and were trying to build a life while raising their two toddlers. Like many couples navigating early adulthood, their relationship had faced difficulties, including periods of separation and reconciliation. Still, friends and family described the household as one where the children were loved and cared for. The father stood firmly beside his wife during those first chaotic days, repeating the same message to reporters that the entire nation wanted to believe. Their children had been taken, and they were praying for their safe return. But while the public focused on the mysterious carjacker described in emotional interviews, investigators quietly began examining the details of the story more closely. The timeline of events raised questions. The location where the carjacking allegedly occurred seemed strangely empty that night, with no witnesses and no physical evidence to support the claim. Officers listened carefully to every version of the account and noticed small inconsistencies beginning to surface. None of those early doubts were made public because the priority remained finding two missing children. Yet behind the scenes, detectives slowly realized that the case might not be what it appeared to be. As the search stretched from hours into days, the pressure mounted. Volunteers combed through wooded areas and waterways, while national media outlets broadcast updates almost nonstop. The image of a mother begging for the return of her children became one of the most recognizable stories in the country. Many people felt a deep emotional connection to the case, especially parents who could not imagine the horror of losing a child so suddenly. The town itself became the epicenter of the investigation, with helicopters flying overhead and law enforcement working around the clock. During those 9 days, the mother continued speaking publicly about the terrifying encounter she said had taken place. She described the alleged carjacker in vague but emotional terms, insisting that someone out there knew something and urging the man responsible to bring her boys home. Each appearance strengthened the perception that she was a grieving parent trapped in unimaginable circumstances. Her husband stood beside her during many of these moments, visibly devastated but supportive, believing the story she told and trusting that the truth would eventually lead authorities to their children. But as the investigation deepened, the narrative began to fracture. Detectives started to focus less on the unknown suspect and more on the person who had last been seen with the boys. The shift happened slowly and quietly, as officers revisited the sequence of events from that October night and compared it with physical evidence from the area where the car was supposedly taken. What they found suggested that something far darker had occurred than anyone initially imagined. The realization that followed would shock the country and transform a heartbreaking missing children case into one of the most disturbing crimes of the decade. The search that had united an entire nation was about to reveal a truth far more devastating than the story that had first been told. As investigators continued to examine the evidence, the case gradually shifted from a search for abducted children to a criminal investigation focused on the events of that October night. Detectives began comparing the details of the carjacking story with the physical layout of the road where it supposedly occurred. Traffic patterns, lighting conditions, and the absence of witnesses all raised serious doubts. Officers also noticed subtle inconsistencies in the statements that had been given during repeated interviews. Small details changed over time, and certain parts of the story no longer aligned with the evidence being gathered. Behind the scenes, investigators relied on a careful and patient strategy. Rather than immediately confronting the mother with accusations, they continued documenting every detail and reconstructing the timeline minute by minute. They studied her movements that evening, the route she claimed to have taken, and the exact moment she said the stranger had approached her vehicle. At the same time, law enforcement examined her personal life, uncovering information that suggested her marriage had been strained and that she had recently become involved in a romantic relationship with another man. According to statements later presented in court records, that relationship carried a significant complication. The man she was seeing had reportedly made it clear that he did not want to raise someone else's children. Investigators also analyzed behavioral cues during interviews. At certain moments, officers observed that her emotional responses appeared delayed or detached when discussing the missing boys. Those observations alone were not proof of a crime, but they added to the growing list of questions surrounding the case. As days passed without a credible sighting of the supposed carjacker, authorities quietly began focusing their attention on the possibility that the disappearance had been staged. The turning point came during a lengthy interrogation conducted after nearly 9 days of searching. Detectives confronted the inconsistencies one by one, pointing out how the physical evidence failed to support the carjacking account. Instead of using aggressive tactics, investigators spoke calmly and methodically, presenting the facts and allowing long silences to fill the room. Gradually, the story that had been repeated on national television began to collapse. Eventually, the confession came. According to the statement later documented in court proceedings, the boys had never been taken by a stranger. Instead, they had been strapped into their car seats inside the family vehicle while their mother drove to a boat ramp at John D. Long Lake. There, in the darkness of the night, she allowed the car to roll into the water with both children still inside. Investigators later recovered the submerged vehicle from the lake, confirming the devastating truth that the search teams had unknowingly been looking for victims who were already gone. During the trial that followed, prosecutors relied heavily on forensic findings and the timeline established by investigators. Autopsy reports and expert testimony were presented to illustrate what had happened once the car entered the water. These details formed the backbone of the state's case, demonstrating that the children had been alive when the vehicle began filling with water. Prosecutors argued that the act was deliberate and calculated, carried out as a way to remove what the defendant believed were obstacles to a different life. The defense attempted to introduce mitigating factors, including testimony about emotional instability and a troubled personal history. Attorneys argued that the crime was the result of overwhelming psychological distress rather than cold planning. Mental health professionals were called to explain aspects of personality traits that might lead someone to avoid problems instead of confronting them directly. Despite these arguments, the evidence presented by the prosecution remained powerful and deeply disturbing. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury ultimately found her guilty of 2 counts of murder. The case then moved into the sentencing phase, where prosecutors sought the death penalty while the defense pleaded for mercy. In the end, the jury chose a different outcome. She was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that under state law meant she would become eligible for parole after serving 30 years. The legal chapter of the case had concluded, but for the families involved and for the community that had followed the search so closely, the emotional consequences were only beginning. As the investigation unfolded in 1994, news coverage quickly transformed the case into one of the most widely followed stories in the United States. For 9 days, television networks carried images of a grieving mother pleading for help, while search teams combed through rural areas of South Carolina. The emotional appeals broadcast across the country created a wave of sympathy. Viewers believed they were witnessing a tragic kidnapping, and many communities organized prayer vigils hoping for the safe return of 2 innocent boys. The narrative shifted dramatically when the truth was revealed. Once authorities confirmed that the children had not been abducted but instead drowned inside the submerged vehicle, the story became a national shock. Media outlets began examining the events leading up to the crime and reporting on the motives investigators had uncovered. Journalists focused particularly on the relationship with the man she had been seeing at the time. According to reports, he had written a letter explaining that he did not want the responsibility of raising children, a revelation that prosecutors later suggested played a critical role in the motive behind the murders. Newspapers and television reports also documented how the false accusation of a carjacker had affected the wider community. The claim that a black man had committed the kidnapping triggered widespread fear and suspicion, leading to numerous police stops and searches during the 9-day investigation. In the aftermath, many commentators criticized how the fabricated description had placed innocent people under scrutiny. Community leaders later spoke about the damage done by that accusation and the anxiety it created for residents who suddenly found themselves under suspicion because of a lie. When the trial began the following year, news organizations closely followed every stage of the proceedings. Courtroom testimony revealed disturbing details about the final moments of the children's lives and the calculated steps taken after the car entered the water. Reports described how prosecutors presented evidence showing that the vehicle had rolled slowly down the ramp before sinking into the lake. Those revelations deeply affected the public, reinforcing the horrifying reality of what had occurred. The sentencing decision also became a major point of national debate. Prosecutors had pushed for the death penalty, arguing that the deliberate nature of the crime justified the harshest punishment available under the law. However, the jury ultimately recommended life imprisonment instead. Media coverage at the time showed a divided public response. Some believed the life sentence was too lenient given the circumstances, while others felt that decades in prison would represent a different kind of punishment that would force the convicted mother to live with the consequences of her actions. In the years that followed, the case continued to appear in documentaries, news retrospectives, and anniversary reports. Journalists revisited the story periodically, especially as new developments emerged from inside the prison system. Reports revealed that her time behind bars had not been without controversy. Prison records showed disciplinary incidents, including allegations involving inappropriate relationships with correctional officers and violations related to contraband and substance use. Each of these incidents renewed media interest, often raising questions about whether she had truly taken responsibility for the crime. 3 decades later, the case returned to national headlines when the possibility of parole approached. News organizations once again revisited the tragedy, recounting the events of October 1994 and reminding audiences of the 2 young boys whose lives had been lost. Television segments replayed archival footage from the original investigation, including the emotional press conferences that had once convinced the country a kidnapping had occurred. Reporters also focused on the impact the crime continued to have on the surviving family members and the small community that had never fully escaped the shadow of the case. As coverage of the parole process unfolded, the story once again sparked intense public discussion. Commentators debated whether 30 years behind bars was enough for a crime of this magnitude, while others reflected on the lasting consequences for the families who had lived with the tragedy for decades. For many people following the news, the case was no longer just a historical crime story. It had become a reminder of how one act of violence could ripple through a community and continue shaping lives long after the courtroom doors had closed. As the years passed, interviews with those closest to the case revealed the lasting emotional damage left behind by the tragedy. Among the most powerful voices was the boy's father, who had once stood beside his wife during the early days of the investigation, believing her story and trusting that their children had been taken by a stranger. In later interviews, he spoke openly about the moment that belief shattered when the truth emerged. He described those 9 days as a period of desperate hope, explaining that he never once doubted the story he had been told. For him, the betrayal was not only the loss of his sons, but the realization that the person he trusted most had created the lie that misled the entire country. During conversations years later, he reflected on the emotional turmoil that followed the trial. He admitted that in the courtroom, as he sat only a short distance away from the woman who had killed their children, anger sometimes overwhelmed him. There were moments, he explained, when he imagined confronting her directly, driven by a rage that felt impossible to control. Yet he also acknowledged that those feelings eventually gave way to something different. Over time, he made the difficult decision to forgive her, not because the pain had disappeared, but because holding on to hatred was consuming him. Forgiveness, he said, was the only way he could continue living without allowing the tragedy to destroy the rest of his life. Family members and friends who spoke publicly over the years described 2 young boys who had been full of life and curiosity. Michael, the older child, had begun developing his personality, learning new words and exploring the world around him with the boundless energy typical of a toddler. Alex, still a baby, was only beginning to take his first steps into that same world. Relatives recalled small, everyday memories, laughter inside the house, toys scattered across the floor, and the simple routines of family life that suddenly vanished overnight. Those memories became the fragments people held onto as the years passed. Investigators and legal officials who worked on the case also offered their reflections in interviews long after the trial ended. Some described the investigation as one of the most emotionally difficult of their careers. The discovery of the truth had forced them to confront a reality that many people struggle to comprehend: a parent intentionally taking the lives of their own children. Prosecutors later explained that the case was particularly disturbing because it contradicted the deeply rooted expectation that parents exist to protect their children at any cost. The betrayal of that bond was what made the crime resonate so strongly with the public. Community leaders also spoke about the tension created during the initial days of the investigation. Because the false story involved a racial description of the supposed carjacker, many residents remembered the fear and suspicion that spread through the area while police searched for a suspect who did not exist. Interviews conducted years later showed how deeply that accusation affected people in the community, especially those who had briefly found themselves under suspicion during the frantic search. In more recent interviews connected to parole hearings, the boy's father again addressed the lasting impact of the crime. By that time, he had rebuilt parts of his life, remarried, and become a parent again. Yet he made it clear that the memories of Michael and Alex had never faded. He spoke about how certain songs, random moments, or everyday experiences could suddenly bring back the weight of their absence. Even decades later, the loss remained present in ways that words could barely capture. When asked about the possibility of the woman responsible being released from prison, his response reflected a mixture of sorrow and exhaustion rather than anger. He explained that the idea of encountering her again in the outside world was deeply unsettling. For him, the issue was not revenge, but the belief that the magnitude of the crime could never truly be balanced by time served. His testimony, along with the voices of others who had lived through the case, revealed how the tragedy continued to echo through their lives long after the headlines had faded. Decades after the trial ended, the case returned to public attention as the sentence reached the point where parole eligibility became possible. Under the terms of the life sentence handed down in the mid-1990s, 30 years behind bars made it legally possible for the convicted mother to request release. By that time, the world around the case had changed dramatically. The two boys, who had once been toddlers in the back seat of a car, would have been adults with families and careers of their own. Instead, their story remained frozen in time, preserved in photographs and memories that their loved ones carried with them through the years. Inside prison, the woman at the center of the case had spent decades living within the strict routines of incarceration. Records from the correctional institution documented both the passage of time and the controversies that followed her there. Disciplinary reports showed incidents that raised questions about her behavior during those years, including violations involving inappropriate relationships with prison staff and issues connected to substance use. These records became part of the material reviewed by officials responsible for evaluating whether she had demonstrated genuine rehabilitation during her time behind bars. When the long-anticipated parole hearing finally arrived, it drew national attention once again. The hearing allowed both the inmate and those affected by the crime to present their perspectives before a board responsible for deciding whether release was appropriate. During the proceeding, she expressed regret for what had happened decades earlier, speaking about the weight of her actions and the years she had spent reflecting on them. Observers noted that her words echoed statements she had made in letters and previous interviews, in which she insisted that the tragedy had been the result of a moment when her life felt completely out of control. Opposition to her release, however, was immediate and forceful. Members of the surviving family attended the hearing to ensure that the voices of the two boys remained present in the room where the decision would be made. Their message focused not on punishment, but on the lasting impact of the crime. They described the birthdays that had passed without celebration, the milestones that would never occur, and the quiet absence that had followed them through the years. For them, the hearing was not simply a legal procedure, but another painful reminder of the night their lives were permanently altered. Legal officials who had participated in the original prosecution also spoke about the case, emphasizing the severity of the crime and the calculated nature of the act that ended the boys' lives. They argued that the passage of time could not erase the deliberate choices that had been made that night. Their statements reflected a broader concern that releasing her could reopen wounds for a community that had struggled for decades to move beyond the tragedy. After reviewing testimony and prison records, the parole board reached its decision. The request for release was denied, and the ruling meant that she would remain behind bars. However, the law allows another request to be submitted in the future, meaning that the possibility of parole will resurface again. For the family members who continue to carry the memory of the two boys, that reality ensures that the case will return to their lives periodically, reopening a chapter they have never truly been able to close. Even with the denial of parole, the legacy of the case remains complicated and deeply emotional. The legal system delivered a sentence, but the consequences of the crime extended far beyond the courtroom. What began as a desperate search for two missing children ultimately became a story about loss, betrayal, and the enduring struggle to find peace after an unimaginable tragedy. Cases like this force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human behavior. When people look back on the events of October 1994, many try to search for a simple explanation. They look for a moment of madness, a sudden emotional collapse, or some outside force that could make the crime easier to understand. But when the evidence and testimony are examined carefully, what stands out most is not chaos or loss of control. Instead, it is the quiet progression of choices that eventually led to an irreversible act. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the betrayal at its center. Society is built on the assumption that parents exist to protect their children above all else. That belief is so deeply rooted that when it is broken, the shock spreads far beyond the family directly involved. The deaths of Michael and Alex were not just a private tragedy. They shook the trust people place in one of the most fundamental human relationships. For many observers, that betrayal is the reason the story has remained so powerful even after 3 decades. Another aspect that continues to haunt this case is the way the initial lie redirected an entire nation's attention. For 9 days, investigators searched for a fictional suspect while the truth remained hidden beneath the surface of a quiet lake. That false accusation did more than mislead police. It caused fear, suspicion, and confusion within a community that had already been thrown into panic by the disappearance of 2 children. The ripple effects of that lie remind us how a single decision can harm far more people than the original act itself. There is also the question of remorse and whether time can truly transform someone who committed such a crime. 30 years is an enormous stretch of time, long enough for entire generations to grow up. Yet in cases like this, the passage of years does not erase the central reality of what happened. 2 young lives were ended before they had the chance to experience the world, and no amount of reflection or regret can restore what was taken. The legal system can determine sentences and parole eligibility, but it cannot measure the weight of a loss that continues to exist in the lives of those left behind. What remains most important, however, is remembering the victims themselves. True crime stories often focus heavily on the person who committed the act, but the real story belongs to the people whose futures were stolen. Michael and Alex were children at the very beginning of their lives, still discovering the world through simple moments that most people take for granted. Their story should not be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. It should be remembered as the loss of 2 human lives, filled with potential, curiosity, and the promise of everything they might have become. In the end, this case stands as a reminder that some crimes are not driven by sudden violence, but by gradual emotional detachment and selfish decisions. It reveals how dangerous it can be when someone begins to view the people around them not as individuals deserving of protection, but as obstacles standing in the way of personal desires. That mindset, once allowed to grow unchecked, can lead to consequences that echo for generations. More than 30 years have passed since that night at the lake, but the silence left behind still carries meaning. It reminds us that behind every headline are real lives that deserved time, laughter, and a future. And in remembering those lives, we ensure that their story remains about more than the darkness that ended it.